Velotypes. Very straw coloration on the cap, fades towards the margin, striate margin. And what I like to call the exploding vulva. Now this is very classic booted base of subsection Pantherinae. One thing I've noticed on velotypes in particular, which this isn't, and it's a much larger girl, is it has this kind of jester's hat. This material around the margin of the vulva cup is not quite smooth as we would see on multisquamosa. We can see here's one, here's one, here's one. Let me spin it around and focus, just so you can see this exploding vulva, which is rather unique to the velotype, subvelotype and velotypes in my opinion. Amanita subvelotypes. Funnel-veiled panther. More multisquamosa. Let's see if I can describe that base that doesn't have that exploding vulva on it. Much more characteristic booted base of the panther. Now this one, the skirt has actually ripped off the stem, and you can see that the margin of the cap over here has pulled it away, and it's still pulling up. More white Amanita. Now this one's a little more unique than the ones we've seen so far. Notice the white Amanita. Notice these really chonky pyramidal warts is what we call them, and they're starting to turn red on the edges. One thing I always like to tell people when they study the Amanita is not necessarily look at the Amanita itself. Look around it. See all the material of these warts that's fallen off already. Take note of the different leaves of the trees that these might be hosting on. This is what we call Amanita subcocherae. This is in section Roanoke ensigns, and I mentioned using old and new names. Some books may still refer to this as section Lepidilla, but we classify this in section Roanoke ensigns now. But as an ex-Lepidilla, we do note this rooting turbinate base that we have. And it also has these shingles, as I call them, of material around the base, around the bulb. And we can see this brick discoloration accumulating on the base here. What we can also see, which is unique to this and a few other members of section Roanoke ensigns, is that it has a double skirt. We have the top side of the skirt, and we also have this bottom side of the skirt here. We only have a handful of members that have this characteristic. Note the short gills, rounded. Note the reddening, very similar to the base. Prominent skirt, white color, rooting base, Amanita subcocherae. So we do have some white Amanitas down here. These are Amanita multisquamosa. Sorry about the exposure, but that's not why we came over here. We came over here for this large girl right here. Now this is a blusher. Much more prominent age than that old girl that we found earlier. Duly noted by the scratches on the cap where it starts to blush. Duly noted by this vellum here of material, the warts that it has on the cap. And we are going to need to dig her up to really get a good look at her. So I did mention earlier how the reddening is primarily seen at the base when there's no blushing on these blushers. One good thing to notice is the size. Notice how it doesn't have a boot or a vulva, it's just a very round clavate base. And this is where the bug and slug damage, whatever was eating this, it starts to blush. This is why we call them blushers. One thing to note in section Validae, which can happen in other sections, is the top side of the skirt. Notice these lines on the top side of the skirt. This is where the partial veil was protecting the gills when it was young, and as it aged and broke away, it has the imprint of the gills still on it. One thing I do want to note here is the color of the warts here. There's this gold and yellow color of whatever warts are left, primarily seen on this one right here, a little bit here, all along the margin. So our blusher group that we have in the Northeast, we have a lot of different blushers up here. They all have their very quirky characteristics to them. This one I refer to as Amanita species Amerarubescens 04, which has yellow universal veil remnants that are left on the cap, but it doesn't have any other yellow, as other blushers have, on the stipe, or on the skirt, or on the bottom of the skirt. This one seems rather unique. How do we know for sure? We dig up the base. So this is a panther. Note that booted base, very smoothly cut on the bottom. I almost thought that this might be Amanita canescens, which, looking at the material of the underskirt, I believe this actually is Amanita brunensens. So how are we going to decide, well, it's very panther-like base you got there, Spike. Why would you call this Amanita canescens? Well, one thing I've seen them before, one thing I've seen them here, and a little secret, we're going to be coming up on one later on in a little bit. So this kind of off-cap shape, this skirt, and I mentioned the material on the bottom of this skirt. This doesn't happen in subsection Pantherine. It doesn't happen in section Amanita to my knowledge. See how it's really tearing away. This really suggests Amanita canescens to me, even though it does have the booted base. So what are we going to make of this? Booted base, is it uncommon? Of course it's uncommon. Is it unheard of? Nothing is unheard of in Amanita. What's a good way that we can really tell? Let's check on the short gills. I mentioned that section Amanita has truncate shorties. Members of section Validae typically have rounded shorties. Ugh, so difficult to see. So let's stretch her out just a little bit to get in there. So notice we don't see those little triangles that the truncate bases generally leave. And if we go slightly at an angle, we can see the slight rounding of these short gills. There's one right here. Is it truncate? Is it short? Well, am I going to break it? I'm going to break it. So, noting this right in the center, we see a couple slight rounded gills of the short ones going down where they're not coming truncate. If I can just fold that one gill over without breaking it. Notice the round edge of the short gills going down, almost attenuate. Hard to make out here. It comes to a point right where my knife tip is. So, sometimes there are mysteries. I'm content with condensance on this. It is known as the golden threads lepidilla. Even though it's not in lepidilla anymore, it's a divergent member of section Vallidae. Funnel-veiled panthers. Funnel-veiled panther. I know what this was. So this little area here typically doesn't have too many Amanita. We may see one or two, but they don't like these high tension wires that I'm walking under right now. They like the woods, they don't like this brush. So I guess while I'm walking through this area, I'll go over some groupings that we have of Amanita. We have section Amanita, which resides in subgenus Amanita, which is in genus Amanita. You can see where this can be confusing. Subgenus Amanita is characterized by testing the spores in Melzer's reagent, which is an iodine-based. Test the starches in the spores. Any mushroom with a lot of high starch content will react, and it'll have what we call amyloid spores, where the iodine, it'll turn, and the other components will turn it gray under the microscope, where we have amyloid spores in the same region will still appear yellow due to the iodine, and won't turn gray at all because they really don't have much for starch. Subgenus Amanita has section Kaisaria, section Vaginata, section Amanita, some funky southern hemisphere section was put in there as well, but all of them have amyloid spores. And then we also have subgenus Amanitina, which now houses section Roanoke ensigns and section Stroboliformis. Those are ex-Lepidilla. We also have section Vallidae, we have section Armadilla, and we have section Phalloideae, along with another kind of weird southern hemisphere small group that all have amyloid spores, which they turn gray in the Melzer's region. I just wanted to point that out if there's any confusion. This is a much larger Caesar that we have here. We can note the striate margin. This is Amanita spreada. Note that big hefty skirt. Note this big hefty vulva that is popping out on the bottom, but notice the striate margin. Now note that hefty vulva and skirt was on the Destroying Angels, but that doesn't have a striate margin. Section Phyloideae has a very smooth margin, minus the fact of the cap being very gray on this. And it doesn't have the pyramidal warts of canescence, so this is more a Kaisaria, which is Amanita spreada, one of our very large oak-loving members. That's so funny, and I don't even see an oak, but it must be here. Oh, right next to it. Silly me. More Destroying Angels. Look at this beautiful cup that they pop out of. Very white. Vaguely see the skirt. I'm going to leave these girls alone. We've seen a few angels today. And going over the section Kaisaria we just did, if we zoom in on this margin, notice that light, dusty material from when it was an egg. Very pearlescent, very dusty, but there's no striate margin on this. Here we have a very old blusher. And here we have Amanita brunensis. Some of these blushers can get very large in size. So I kind of went over the sections of the set out by Q in 2018. Before that, we were using the Bass monograph, Cornelius Bass, godfather of Amanita. He had everything in 7 sections. Now we have 11. Amanita brunensis. No striate margin. Skirt. Those little red blushes. Here we have a family of starfoot. How do I know it's a starfoot without seeing the foot? I can tell by that reddish discoloration. With its size, the skirt, and if I were to dig one up, and collect the base, we would see that big bulbous base that's cleft. Some of these younger ones up here may have a better characteristic of it. So this one has its bulbous base, but it still has this material left on the margin. The upper apex of the bulb, should I say, which we can peel off a little bit. Duly noted the potato aroma that these have. Here we have a much younger blusher. I mentioned the ones with the yellow vellum we call Amanita species Amerarubescens 04, out of the Amerarubescens clade that we have here in the Northeast. Sometimes they develop that scaly stipe I mentioned on section phalloideae. This is due to meteorological conditions. If it grew up really fast, it starts to kind of shred on the edges, but it does have the classic lined upper skirt of Validae. And it's white underneath with blushing at the base. Here we have another family of Amanita brunenscens. Note this dark coloration to the pellicle here. And much more distinct booted cleft base, which still has some of the material of the vulva left right here. Little pan up. And I do have a young destroying angel here. Very white, very hard to focus. Has the distinct base that it's coming from. Now this one is very deep. Difficult to me get it out. This one I would be a little more comfortable calling Amanita ameriverosa. Even though it's very young, they're a very large destroying angel that we have. Which is very characteristic to have a large bulbous base and a very tall vulva. And notice I had to dig it about 2 inches down here just to get her out. And we can see another one over there. Now I did want to point out, we have our destroying angel. And we also have our Aestivalis, which is our white starfoot Amanita. So the dangers with Amanita primarily reside in misidentification of species. And this looks like about more size. So if we put them together, you may be like, well, that's rather uncanny. Well, what do we got to do with Amanita? We want to dig the bases up. Note how one has this sac, which you can almost peel away if you really want to. and one doesn't have the sac, but it has this cleft jutting out base on it. Mild blushing on this right here. Now, I'll mention again, the dangers of eating Amanita really have to do with toxic members and misidentification. Amanita aestivalis is actually one of my favorite edible species in the whole genus. Very flavorful. I only like the stipe for some reason, but maybe a young one will taste alright. And I've heard the Destroying Angels taste very good, but I like my liver so much I haven't tried them yet. So that may be the almost conclusion of our Amanita hunt today. That looks like a bolete. Boletes. We'll conclude this part of the Amanita hunt. Way down this trail I did see a nice member, so I may coin that in towards the end of the video to show for another Amanita detailed out. But I hope you enjoyed today. It's a very good time of year that we have here, end of summer, early autumn in Rhode Island. And I hope you enjoyed viewing our diverse array of Amanita. Thank you for sharing.